right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our special Saturday episode of Blowback. We are very honored to have a couple special guests today. We've got Dimitri Lascaris. He just got home to Toronto. He is a journalist, activist, and lawyer. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for joining us. We got Regis Tremblay, friend of the show, documentarian activist, live from Crimea. And as usual, my co-host Ben Toth in Pécs, Hungary.
You got it.
And again, I'm the only one who it's morning for. I don't think it's morning in Hungary or Toronto or Crimea. But thank you guys for joining us. There's so much to discuss. I know we wanted to start off by talking about a recent report from Ukraine that kind of is a little bit jaw-dropping. Dimitri, could I let you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to talk to you all today. Looking forward to the discussion. Just by way of background, it's been almost 2 years since, as the Russian government calls it, the special military operation began in Ukraine. I personally here in Canada was speaking out within a matter of days of this operation having begun, because I was following quite closely what was going on in Ukraine and Crimea prior to this, and I was aware that this was escalating due to the shenanigans of Western governments, and it was becoming dangerously violent, the entire conflict, and destabilized. And so from the moment that I spoke out in this country, which has been one of the most incredibly aggressive supporters of Zelensky's regime, I came under vicious attack, relentless attack. And there were others. I wasn't the only one. And all of us, anybody who dared to question the mainstream narrative, was really smeared relentlessly. And then, it was just brought to my attention this morning that a Ukrainian Canadian who had traveled to Ukraine recently, it appears that her name is Maria Matushuk. I may be mispronouncing that. And by the way, just to prove that she was there, she posted on Twitter a photograph of her visa that was issued to her by the Ukrainian border authorities when she entered the country. And she gives an account which is even worse than I had imagined. And what she said is the following: everything we have heard about what's happening in Ukraine is a lie. The reality is darker, bleaker, and unequivocally hopeless. There is no such thing as Ukraine, quote, winning this war. And then she lists some examples of what she witnessed and heard from Ukrainians. By their estimates, they have lost over 1 million of their sons, fathers, and husbands. An entire generation is gone. Even in the Southwest, where anti-Russian sentiment is long-standing, citizens are reluctant or straight up scared to publicly criticize Zelensky. They will go to jail. In every village and town, the street shops and restaurants are mostly absent of men. The few men who remain are terrified of leaving their homes for fear of being kidnapped into conscription. Some have resorted to begging friends to break their legs to avoid service. Army search parties take place early in the morning when men leave their home to go to work. They ambush and kidnap them off the streets within 3 to 4 hours. They get listed in the army and taken away straight to the front with minimal or no training at all. It is, quote, a death sentence, and it's getting worse every day. Mothers and wives fight tooth and nail with the armed forces, beg and plead not to have their men taken away. The territory celebrated as having been won back from Russia has been reduced to rubble and is uninhabitable. They see the way the war has been reported at home and abroad as a joke, in quotation marks, and propaganda, quotation marks. They say, look around, is this winning? Worse, some have been hoaxed into believing that once Ukrainian forces are exhausted, American soldiers will come in and replace them and win the war. And I'll just conclude with these remarks. And I commend this tweet to people if they really want to get a sense of what's happening in Ukraine. She says, shame on the people, regardless of their intentions, who have supported the war, and shame on the media for continuing to lie about it. I don't take pleasure in saying I told you so when the reality that has been revealed is the destruction of a country. It gives me absolutely no pleasure to say I told you so. It shouldn't give anybody any pleasure. All of this was foreseeable. All of it was predictable. All of this was knowable to anybody who was willing to pay attention and who applied to the Western propaganda an appropriate degree of skepticism and critical thinking. And shame on those people. I can only repeat what she said. Shame on those people who lied the Ukrainian people and the West into the destruction of this tragically devastated country.
Absolutely.
Well said, Dimitri. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Devastating, but just to get your blood boiling a little bit, right after that punch of reality, let's watch a short video clip from Davos by Mr. The tiny face, what do you call him?
American troops
Mr.
on the
Kuleba.
ground. So you save the most important, you save few lives of your soldiers. So we kind of offer the best deal on global market of security. Give us the weapons, give us the money, and we will finish the job. American troops.
That's all it is. You give us the money, you give us the weapons, we'll finish the job. Your people don't die. He doesn't add it, but in brackets, ours do. I mean, the closest I think I've heard of this estimate was from Andrei Martyanov, who did a review of the new cemetery plots in Ukraine. And he said it's probably around 1 million. And we can take it as sort of confirmed now. Absolutely devastating. I just can't get around these people like Kuleba, like Yaroslav Hunka in your parliament not so long ago, you know.
2 standing ovations.
Yeah.
And this man publicly acknowledged long before he got standing ovations that he had been a member of the Waffen SS. He was proud of it. And our parliament didn't know.
I mean, what's with the education system? If someone says he fought Russia in World War II, to me, it was obvious who he is, but not to any lawmaker.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this. It's really one of the remarkable footnote to that whole disgusting scandal in Canada's parliament is a good friend of mine who's a professor named Radhika Desai.
Yes.
She attended, as you may know, the Valdai conference, the most recent one. I think it happened a couple of months ago. She was invited to go, and she actually got an opportunity to ask President Putin a question. And she took the opportunity to ask 2. One question was, what do you think of what happened in the parliament? And the second question was, a good friend of mine by the name of Boris Kargalitsky, who's a left-wing critic of the Russian government, is in jail in Russia. He's been charged with, I believe it was, inciting terrorism because of comments he made about attacks on the Kerch Bridge. And by the way, both Radhika and I, we know Boris, we disagree with what he was saying about the war. But nonetheless, Radhika took this up with President Putin. So you can imagine what President Putin's response was to, the Hunka scandal in Canada's parliament. He had some rather choice words for that.
Oh, but tell us. I'm really curious what he said.
Well, he said that either I'm kind of paraphrasing, but he said, look, there are 2 possibilities here. The Speaker of Canada's Parliament, who claimed not to know, is either a liar or a moron. How could you not know that somebody who fought against the Russians in World War II, which is how he was introduced by the Speaker of Canada's Parliament, who subsequently resigned, by the way. Yeah. How could you not know that he was likely almost certainly fighting on the side of the Nazis? I mean, come on. But as I said, he was also openly bragging about the fact that he was a member of the Galicia Waffen SS for years prior to this. And they said the other possibility is, he's just lying through his teeth. And personally, I think they kind of knew. I think that, and I've submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Canadian government, to the Foreign Ministry, asking them for all information they had about this character in the months leading up to this scandal. And I'm expecting a response in the next couple of weeks, so we'll see what they have to say. But the second question, this is really kind of interesting to me, and the media said nothing about it. Because Radhika, when she came back from Russia, she was not only pilloried in the press, but agents of the Canadian government interrogated her and her partner, Alan Freeman, when they entered the country. And then went back to her house weeks later and interrogated her again, a well-respected Canadian academic. So what happened subsequently when Radhika, and she didn't tell anybody she was going to ask President Putin the question about Boris Kargalitsky. Kargalitsky was released. I should say Putin responded by saying, I promise that I will look into this. Send me a letter, and I promise I will look into this. And he was released and only had to pay a fine for a charge. And I have no way of knowing whether the charge is justified or not. I'm just saying he was charged with something that could have led to imprisonment, as I understand it, and he was released with a modest fine. Whether this is a result of Radhika's intervention, I don't know, but it certainly isn't consistent with what we consistently are told about Russia here in the West. All of this, So
That's true. No, I didn't know that. I know we had Alan on one of our programs, and he had mentioned that they had gone to a previous conference there, and he was able to ask Putin a question. But I didn't know they just went months ago. But that was great that her advocacy quite possibly resulted in getting Boris free. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about the supporters of this inhuman war in Ukraine, inhumane war, and, shame on the Western supporters. But to what degree are the Ukrainians themselves culpable? Like, shouldn't they have known better than to throw their lot in with the West? I mean, doesn't any kind of critical thinking, help you realize that, the West isn't going to start World War III over Ukraine. It's going to be, they're going to be used, chewed up and spit out, by the West, and they should have known that. So I think, the Ukrainians themselves have a degree of shame for choosing, and it's up to them now. They need to do something about the Zelensky regime.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but I agree that it's hard to understand how anybody looking at recent history, Ukrainian or otherwise, could have believed that Western governments were motivated by a desire to uphold international law, human rights, and democracy in Ukraine. So everybody should have known from the outset that that was a bald-faced lie. I mean, after what they did to Iraq, after what they did to Libya, after devastating Afghanistan for 20 years, leaving the country, abandoning their proxies, allowing the Taliban to come back into power. Of course, we all know the list of crimes of the United States government and its Western vassals is so long that we can't possibly review it all in the space of this conversation. But it should have been obvious to anybody that there was another motivation. It wasn't about democracy, human rights, international law. So that raises the question, well, what are they doing? What is the real objective here? And nobody was asking that question in the mainstream media. And a lot of Ukrainian people, sadly, seem not to have asked that question either. I'm sure there were people who did ask that question. A lot of them are now living in parts of Ukraine or what was Ukraine that are now under Russian control. A lot of them left the country, millions of people. We don't know what they think, so they may have known better. But it's clear that a very significant segment of the Ukrainian population was duped by this propaganda, and they should have known better from the outset. I'm sad to say. It gives me no pleasure in saying that.
I mean, Zelensky did run on a platform of improving relations with Russia. Yeah. And so, I guess people that voted for him were duped. But it's a terrible situation. Ben, you have queued up another clip.
Yeah, this is the Yale very objective historian Timothy Snyder, one of the most punchable faces in academia, also at the WEF, who explains it this way: what's happening
in their way back to Europe. And I can't help but think that the lesson that a country has to lose a war could be more clearly stated when we speak about the European Union. That is to say, it's not just that Ukraine has to win, it's that Russia has to lose. Those are both independently good things, I believe. Secretary Pritzker,
with Secretary Pritzker. That's what it's all about. Russia has to lose. That's their new narrative. They've been separated from winning in Ukraine. It's so disgusting to see this in just at face, I want to bring on something I mentioned yesterday, but that was another topic, that there was a NATO, look, we're celebrating something like 75 years, official Twitter post. And all of the comments were Ukrainian with yellow, blue flags, and they were very upset, like incredibly. Like, we thought that you were going to die for us, not us dying for you. And one of the commenters said, we just wanted the Europeans to agree with us like they do at summits and protect our rights, and we want the Americans to act like they do in Hollywood movies. That was the comment, and it was funny, but at the same time somehow really sad,
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Regis. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this didn't start in 2014. It didn't start in 2022 with a special military operation.
1945.
Exactly. 1945, at least 1945, when Truman dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was assigned to Stalin. I have documented these last 78 years on all of the lies, the propaganda, the broken promises, and outright provocations of Russia, Soviet Union, and then Russia. The list is endless. It's been the goal of the United States of America, at least since 1945, to rape and steal and plunder Russia and its assets. George H.W. Bush sent in the Harvard boys with one Jeffrey Sachs, who
Yes.
implemented his shock therapy on the Russian economy. It resulted in 1 million deaths, incredible unemployment, alcohol and drug addiction, the non-payment of wages and pensions, violent crime, and the privatization of Russia's assets.
Yeah.
He worked with Anatoly Chubai and created this oligarch class. And in 2000, one Vladimir Putin was elected president. And for the last 23 years, he and others have raised Russia from the ashes of Jeffrey Sachs' shock therapy on the Russian economy. The job is still not finished. But when people think that this thing just started in 2014 or 2022, it's absolutely wrong. They need to learn and study their history.
There's what, Regis, I'm so glad you raised this whole shock therapy experience that Russia had. And I want to connect what you just said to your discussion about the Ukrainian people being misled. The latest lie, it's an outright lie, is that Ukraine is going to be admitted to the European Union. First of all, this ain't happening. Okay, and it's not because of Viktor Orban. It's not going to happen because the French and German governments will never allow it to happen. They are lying through their teeth. And the reason why I can say with utter confidence is they're not going to let it happen is because if they actually extended the legal regime in the European Union to Ukraine, this would mean that this absolutely devastated country is now going to be fully integrated into Ukraine. There's going to be free movement of people back and forth. They're not going to want that. They're already at the limit of what they can tolerate in terms of dealing with the massive outflows of Ukrainian refugees. But more than anything, the country is hopelessly corrupt. There are weapons all over the damn place. Who knows where those, and the country is in need of massive injections of economic aid to sustain Ukraine. The cost to the European Union would be absolutely immense. And that the idea that these people are going to allow Ukraine into the European Union with all the benefits and obligations that entails is laughable. It's totally laughable. And the thing I would say to any Ukrainians who are listening to us today is that even if it were true, why would you want to be a member of this dysfunctional, evil family? And I can say this with confidence because I'm with you. And I saw what the European Union did to the country of Greece. What it did through shock therapy, privatization, and neoliberalism was it destroyed this beautiful country. Even with all its flaws, it was a much better place before it entered the European Union than it is today. And I don't think, frankly, that in my lifetime, sadly, Greece will ever recover from the politics and economic policies of this profoundly anti-democratic union, as they call it. It's not even a union. It's just an excuse for imposing technocratic will upon the people and depriving us of democracy. That's what it is. So, be careful what you wish for, fellow people in Ukraine. You really don't want to be part of this dysfunctional family, I would suggest to you.
I'm going to add, don't worry, we'll help you because of my prime minister, Mr. Orban, and on one of our neighbors, Mr. Fico, has already vowed, no, sir, this is not going to happen over our dead bodies. And the second thing, this is even less likely, and negative likely, is NATO, because that's instant war. Sorry, you are not joining. It will be an infinite carrot, to stream.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I left it out of my little historical bird's eye view, but with the fall of the Berlin Wall, Secretary of State James Baker and others promised to Gorbachev that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward towards Russia. Bill Clinton came in and immediately broke that promise. And since that time, 14 former Soviet republics belong to NATO.
One of our biggest mistakes.
And if people can only put themselves in Russia's shoes, what does that look like? And now, I think this latest, the largest military exercises, war games, Defender Democracy or something like that, is going to take place very soon. And it's going to last for several months. There's going to be 90,000 NATO troops parading through Europe and these NATO countries. If you're Vladimir Putin or anybody in the Russian military, you know that these war games are gaming and planning an attack on you.
Explicitly, yeah.
Explicitly, they don't even hide it. And so, as you just mentioned, one of the major reasons for the Russian special military operation was to deny the possibility of NATO becoming an aircraft carrier in Ukraine, the United States becoming an aircraft carrier in Ukraine. That was never going to happen. And Putin will never allow Ukraine, if we've been talking about and arguing, to become part of the European Union, which is falling apart now and is basically bankrupt.
Going down
and the same thing is happening to the people across Europe, is austerity economics and politics. I don't see much of a future for it. Anyway, throw it back to you, Dimitri. The people have been lied to. They've been propagandized, not only in the United States and Europe, but in Ukraine. They were lied to.
Just a quick addendum, and then I'll give it to you, Dimitri. But what Regis mentioned about NATO not expanding one more inch to the east, people say, well, that was just a verbal agreement. Shame on you for trusting the Yankees. It wasn't. It was declassified from the London archives. It was a written agreement. And as all Western agreements, they just didn't respect it. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah. The thing is, I have to say this sitting here in Canada today, to Canadians who may be listening to our conversation, Ukrainian membership in NATO is profoundly contrary to the interests of Canada. And in fact, and I say this with all due respect to our brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe, that purely from a security perspective, incorporating countries in Eastern Europe into NATO makes no sense whatsoever, particularly the Baltic states. So let's imagine a scenario, which isn't going to happen. It's total nonsense, that Russia attacks Canada. Do we really believe that the Estonians and the Lithuanians and the Latvians, they're going to send military forces over here that are going to meaningfully protect Canadians from a Russian invasion?
They're towns pretending to be countries.
Yeah. So, those Baltic states, it's crazy.
Yeah, so we gain nothing in Canada, absolutely nothing from a guarantee from the Latvians and the Estonians and the Lithuanians, and even from the Poles and the Romanians and the Bulgarians, that they're going to come to our defense if we're attacked by Russia or China. Nothing. However, if they're attacked, which is much more likely given the historical tensions that exist between those countries and Russia,
and what they've been spewing for the last 30 years.
Exactly. Yes. They're like spewing hatred. They're like, it seems like they're on the warpath against the Russian Federation. We would have to potentially send our larger military forces over there. We have a much bigger military budget than they do, and we would see our men and women in uniform being killed, and huge amounts of money being poured into a war. So this is a terrible deal for Canadians, absolutely terrible deal for Canadians. And yet nobody in this country, nobody in the mainstream media or in the entirety of Parliament questions the wisdom of incorporating countries like Ukraine or Finland. There's another country. Why the hell would we want Finland in NATO as Canadians? What possible advantage is there to us of that? It's only downside. But nobody will even question the wisdom of doing this. Everybody was immediately on board with the idea of NATO expansion. It just makes no sense from a security perspective for Canada to do that.
And the people in Finland, the people in Sweden are all against what their government has done. Sweden is begging to get into NATO. There are military bases there, American military bases in both of those countries.
Yeah.
You don't hear about it. It's never talked about. I don't understand why these people are so afraid of Russia when Russia has never attacked any of them. both of them, over the
Attacked.
centuries, have attacked Imperial Russia.
True. I read a tweet which I think would be fitting. It's from an Italian journalist, a very cool guy, Thomas Fazzi. I don't know if you know him. He said the worst and scariest marriage that has recently come around in Europe is these bureaucratic technocrats in Brussels falling in love with Baltic Nazis, was basically the tweet, because I think they want Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, to become the new Josip Borrell, whatever his title is, the high representative of diplomacy or something like that. And that really is some of the scariest developments. It's like the north of Europe has been de facto occupied by the US, and the south, it looks like, is sobering up somewhat. At least a few countries are. Most people still have bureaucrats in charge, but,
Yeah.
we'll see.
I have to, as somebody, I've been around, I'm 60 years old now, and I went to Europe when I was a child, and I lived
You're
in France.
60?
Yeah, I'm 60.
Jesus, you look good, man.
Well,
Yeah,
that's-
he looks like
shaved my hair,
he looks like 40. Well, I shaved my hair too, but you know what?
You look like 42.
Yeah,
So,
right. Yeah, 40 is a long time ago.
Yeah,
Holy
so
shit. Sorry, continue.
we've been around the block. I went to, the first foreign country I visited was, I was born and raised in Canada when I was taken to Greece by my parents 3 times when I was a boy. And then I lived in France in the 90s when I worked there in Paris for a New York law firm. And, spent a lot of time in Europe. And I have to tell you that I'm absolutely astonished at the complete surrender of European sovereignty.
Yeah.
It's just become a huge American colony. And you see this at all levels. It's not just in terms of the foreign policy of the European Union, which is now completely beholden to dictates from Washington. You see it in their economic policies, the neoliberal economic policies that they're adopting. You see it in the so-called culture, what you see on television in Europe now. It's so dominated by so-called American culture, which is really just propaganda dressed up as, something more sophisticated. You see it in the food that they're eating. You see it in the decline in the quality of the food that is being consumed by people in Western Europe now. It's just become an American colony in every conceivable sense. And I never imagined when I was a boy growing up, even when I was living in France, that was still very much the France of de Gaulle back in the 90s and Francois Mitterrand. Whatever you may have thought of them, they actually did try to preserve the sovereignty of France. And they were successful to a significant degree. Now, under Macron, that's all it is. That's all it is.
Yeah.
The Europeans really they need to wake up fast before the little remains of their sovereignty, if there's any left, is completely extinguished.
What do you guys think the West wants from Russia? Like, if the West can just wish and have anything they want, like, what is the result that they are trying for, desperately seeking? I have an answer, but I'm wondering if you guys.
I thought Regis already said it's basically Yeltsin 2.0, a drunkard in charge and loot and maybe balkanize it. Yugoslavia, maybe.
That's what it's always been about. It's about the lust and the greed for Russia's territory, which is the largest country in the world, and its vast, unlimited resources that the rest of the world has always needed. This is what it's always been about. And that's what Jeffrey Sachs was involved in. George Herbert Walker Bush was the one who plotted the breakup of the Soviet Union and the rape and pillage of Russia's economy. He wanted to make Russia balkanize a bunch of pieces, totally controlled by the United States. Totally. That's always been the plan.
On the flip side, what does Russia want? Like, what would make Putin happy? Like, what is he going to be like in his wildest dreams? Like, what would be great from his perspective?
I'll answer that first. Just before the special military operation, Putin sent Russia's security guarantees to the United States, the EU, NATO, and the OSCE. They were categorically rejected. He just wanted to be assured of Russia's security, period. But Vladimir Putin has had a come to Jesus moment. Putin, when he became president in the year 2000, wanted to join NATO and the EU, European. That's where he was going. He held on to that for 20 some years until finally he was betrayed for the last time over the Minsk agreements. When Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, and Pietro Poroshenko said they just agreed to the Minsk agreements to buy time to increase Ukraine's military.
To attack Russia.
That was the breaking point. And Putin in his speeches, and I watch all of them. I read them all. He has said, Russia now has turned to the east. We've left the West behind. There's no possibility of negotiations or talks or anything with the United States and the West right now. And this is where Russia stands. This is what it's all about.
So Putin would be happy with normalized relations and continuing to export cheap energy to Western Europe in perpetuity, raising living standards in both Western and Eastern Europe. Like, that's kind of what Putin would love to see happen, right? I mean,
yeah, I think he's given up on that dream now. I
was going to say not anymore. Or you need to have sober, reasonable leaders again, because current configuration.
Exactly.
Go, Dimitri.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to add just a little detail, and I completely agree with Regis's assessment of what the Putin government. We talk all the time about Putin, and we fall into this trap. It's the Russian government. There's a lot in that government. I make that mistake, often because of the dialogue we have over here, which is so concentrated on one person in the Russian government. But in any event, as I understand the security architecture that the Russian Federation proposed to the U.S. government and its NATO vassals, they wanted NATO military forces to be withdrawn to essentially where they were at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. As I understand it, the Russian government wasn't demanding that the countries of Eastern Europe be taken out, those that are already in NATO, that they be taken out of NATO and the protection of the reciprocal defense provisions of the NATO agreement. They were prepared to leave those in place, the Russian Federation, but what they wanted was the military forces, and particularly the missiles of NATO, to be withdrawn to where they were.
And Romania.
And if that were to happen, it would actually be a better deal for NATO than the one they agreed to put in place at the time of the demise of the Soviet Union, when they told Gorbachev that they would not expand eastward. I think the way to interpret that was not only they wouldn't send their military forces into Eastern Europe, but that they wouldn't give the reciprocal guarantee of mutual defense to Eastern European countries. Russia is prepared to put up with that, even though it is a violation of the promise that was made to Gorbachev at that time. What they want is the forces themselves to be withdrawn to the pre-NATO the pre-1991 borders of NATO. And personally, I think that's again in the interests of the citizens of NATO countries, because it will reduce tensions, and it will also reduce the cost of NATO, because having military forces of our country, for example, stationed in Eastern Europe on a permanent or semi-permanent basis is very costly. So why the hell wouldn't we sit down at the table and actually hash out the details of an agreement along those lines? It's the right thing to do because that's what we promised, but it also is the thing that's in our own interests, frankly.
Yeah. And what those people don't understand is Russia definitely has missiles, hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhals, aimed at every single one of those threatening countries, including Brussels, including the UK, including France, and without any doubt, the United States of America. They have their submarines in the Atlantic and the Pacific. They can strike anywhere at any time. And these countries have no defense against Russia's superiority right now when it comes to hypersonic missiles. This is a death wish. It's suicidal what they're doing, in my opinion.
I agree. Mr. Sarmat is now in operation, which is it's a multi-accord ballistic hypersonic missile that NATO admits there is no defense against. So if you really want that, I love that. Maybe we can sort of expand from Ukraine that what Russia has done in Ukraine, which has devastated the image of, the undefeatable armor, the Leopards, the air defenses. It's just destroyed this image of NATO being undefeatable, and it's spread out to become
the United States
and the United States. They're pricey gadgets. There's no wonder they're not sending their 1970s F-16s, by the way, because they would get destroyed instantly. That it turned into a kind of global resistance. And, the Russians are active in Africa. They're kicking out the French. Right now, I think Russia is going back on a 1956 treaty with the British, saying you can't fish in the Barents Sea anymore. They're attacking fish and chips, which I love. And also, of course, the Middle East recently came on fire. And I'm wondering if anybody got some thoughts on the whole thing being, I think, sort of different fronts of a single struggle, but maybe that's just me.
Let me just before we move to the Middle East, because there's a ton of stuff to discuss there.
Sure.
With the Ukraine, based on what we're talking about, it seems like the solution to the conflict is to have the West and the United States to give up its desire and its effort and its ambition to balkanize Russia and control all their resources. So if they could do that, it seems like everything would be better and solved. So I think I'm sure everybody can agree with that on the
I think
go ahead, Dimitri.
Look, if you pay attention to the Western discourse about the war, which I do more than it's good for my health, and have been doing for 2 years, there's been a dramatic change in what the mainstream media outlets are telling us about this war. So, for example, there was an article, I'm sure you gentlemen have read it or heard about it, in Time magazine a couple of months ago, where they were quoting close aides to Zelensky, describing him as delusional.
Oh, yes.
And saying about the prospects of winning, and saying, that people were in the Ukrainian government were stealing like there's no tomorrow. That was another quote. That people on the front line in Ukraine were refusing to attack, even if the orders came directly from the office of Zelensky, because they thought it was simply suicidal. So you would never have seen these types of commentaries in the mainstream media in the West during the first 18 months or so of the proxy war. Now they're all over the place. That's just one example. I'm sure you guys have seen the reports in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in the Financial Times, even in The Economist, and Bild magazine in Germany is starting to admit that the gig is up. So they're laying the groundwork, I think, for what will be a surrender, although they'll try to characterize it as some kind of a victory.
Yeah, that's it.
And to me, another sign of this, we haven't talked about it, is that one by one, NATO countries, I think the first one may have been Britain. I may be mistaken about that. And one of them, as I understand, is France. And in Canada now, we're being told, are doing bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, which is idiotic for the reasons I've already stated. Absolutely. Why would we want to do that? That makes no sense from a perspective of Canadian security. But I think it's a consolation prize for the Zelensky government, the regime there, because what they're doing is they're giving him something in lieu of NATO membership. All the signs are that we're seeing the groundwork being laid for a capitulation, which will be characterized as some kind of a victory or a defeat of Russia. That's another way they might spin it. And the problem that we confront right now, though, is that the neocons haven't given up on escalating this war. They're still there, and they're still going to try to find a way to do that. And as the moment of truth arrives, where it'll all be clear to everybody that NATO has suffered a strategic defeat, they may try to pull something off that is going to escalate this even further. So we're not out of the woods yet. But the signs are, I think, hopeful that finally we'll be bringing this depraved, insanely dangerous proxy war to an end.
A small detail, and then Regis, I know you have something to say. I read the entire agreement. It was Zelensky's office published it, the one with Britain. And the word guarantee was in there only once. And that was for Ukraine guarantees I think the protection of UK intellectual property. There is no guarantee that UK will rush to the rescue. But apparently, Melnik, the head of Zelensky's office, said that we have to rush to perfidious Albion's defense if they're attacked. So it's that stupid. Go ahead, Regis.
Yeah, I want to point out there are going to be no negotiations to end this.
Oh no!
If anybody is paying any attention to what President Putin has said repeatedly, and Lavrov, Peskov, Putin's press secretary, there are three conditions, three goals of Russia. One,
for 2 years now,
the demilitarization of Ukraine. That means not just Ukraine. That means NATO. That means the United States. That means mercenaries, advisors, whoever's there. That's what that means. I don't want to make any mistake about that. The second condition is the denazification of Ukraine. Now, that will only come about as a political objective. You've got 78 years of propaganda in Western Ukraine about Bandera, a national hero now, about Nazis, the whole bit.
Shukevich.
So that will take Russia a long time before you can purge that from parts of Ukraine, not all of Ukraine. And the third goal is ensuring the neutrality of Ukraine. In other words, it's never going to be part of the EU. It's never going to be NATO. And in order to do that, what Russia has to do is purge the existing government and institute a new constitution. This is what all of this means. Whatever the United States and NATO, Europe need to do to save face, I don't think they can save face. But Putin is not about to sit down at the table and negotiate with anybody. It's not about territory. It's about those three goals of the special military operation.
They don't need territory. And by the way, the operative word from Putin, even Shoigu and Medvedev and others, is the West is agreement incapable. Even if we do an agreement and freeze the conflict, we know they're preparing for the next attack, and we won't do that.
Good point.
So we want to move on to Israel-Palestine. I mean, that's...
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can start by answering Ben's excellent question about the bigger picture. And I couldn't agree more with, what Ben suggested, is that all of these conflicts that we're seeing in Western Africa, for example, in Niger, Mali, what we're seeing in Yemen, what we're seeing in Iraq, what we're seeing in Ukraine, what we're seeing in Gaza, what we're seeing in the south of Lebanon, the north of Israel. This is all part of a larger trend, which is the collapse of U.S. hegemony and the realization of these countries that have lived under the jackboot of Western dominance for so long that they have before them an historic opportunity to finally break free from the yoke of servitude to the West. And in one way or another, there are uprisings happening all over regions of the world that have been historically dominated in the post-World War II period by the United States government. They're fed up, and the gig is up. And people can see now that, not just simply because of the economic issues which the West confronts, but primarily the incompetence of Western militaries and the U.S. military, the complete incapacity after pouring the amount of money, as I understand it, that they claim that the paper value of the weaponry which they gave to Ukraine in the first year or so of the war was in excess of the entire military budget of the Russian Federation. Okay, and they're continuing to send weapons, and still Russia defeated them. If you look at by every metric, whether it's population, whether it's GDP, whether it's military spending, whether it's the size of their military forces, NATO should have won this war. And yet NATO has been crushed in Ukraine. You look at what happened in Afghanistan, 20 years, trillions of dollars they poured into that. They were defeated by the ragtag Taliban, who had nothing better than Soviet-era small arms. The entirety of NATO had its ass kicked in Afghanistan. And now Israel, which is basically, as I've said many times, a huge military base, United States military base masquerading as a country, with this massive military budget relative to its principal foes, with almost $4 billion a year in military aid coming from the United States, can't effectively defeat Hezbollah. and can't even defeat Hamas in Gaza, where it has wreaked unbelievable levels of devastation upon the civilian population. They haven't killed one senior Hamas leader in Gaza. They haven't recovered alive one single hostage. They've sustained thousands of wounded and killed soldiers, going up against a small insurgency force that has a tiny fraction of the military capacity of the Israeli military. So everywhere you look, and people can see it in the non-Western world, it's obvious that the United States and its allies are a paper tiger. They are weaker and more vulnerable now than they have ever been. And anger is built up to the point where peoples everywhere are going to take advantage of this opportunity and finally kick the Americans out. That's what's happening. And, if we in the West had any sense about us, we would say, it's time for us to give you your freedom. The last thing I want to say is there was this quote that George Bush used when he was, after the 9/11 attacks to justify why they had happened. People needed to understand, why would people from the Muslim and Arab world do these things?
They hate us for our freedom.
They hate us for our freedom. The truth is that we hate their freedom. That's the truth. And that's why we have violent conflict in all these parts of the world.
Very well said. Very well said.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Dimitri. Ben, you have this clip.
This is from today. I don't know if you guys have seen. The audio is not important.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. I've heard about it. They forgot to go. They did reverse instead of forward. Ooh. It's awful.
What is that?
That is two Royal Navy British boats in the port of Bahrain somewhere. So we should now play God Save the Queen or Rule Britannia or something like that, because that's it. And one of them is out of service. It just appeared on the Daily Mail. So these are the guys threatening 30,000 Houthi rebels or Ansar Allah.
This just happened?
Yes, this is. I think this morning is when I first saw this. Yeah. I mean,
in Britain's defense, their navy is severely understaffed. So I hope that,
they look for an admiral for a submarine on LinkedIn. They
right. Colonel Douglas McGregor, you may have seen, just did an interview where he called the British military a Lilliputian, which I thought was a very
that is good description.
And yet they're running, they're around pounding their chest, running around the world, threatening the Russians, threatening the Houthis, threatening Hezbollah. They become nothing but an annoying yapping poodle, the British government and the military. And it's time for them to come, to gain a sense of reality that they're inconsequential. Other than the fact that they have some nukes, their country has become inconsequential. And they need to, assume a place in the world order that is commensurate with their very, very limited economic and military power.
Yeah, exactly. Phantom pains of empire. I thought the Suez Canal moment was enough to say, okay, Britain, hold on, you're no longer. But they still have it for some reason.
Yeah.
What about the ICJ, Dimitri? How do you think that's going to go? Do you think court is going to what are they're deciding whether or not a ceasefire is necessary to prevent a possible genocide? Is that what's going on there?
Yes. So South Africa has asked for what lawyers call provisional measures, which is basically sort of like a preliminary order that is designed to protect the civilian population, the target of the potential genocide. And so what they seek is, yes, a ceasefire, an order requiring the introduction of adequate amounts of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip, the preservation of any evidence by the Israeli authorities, any evidence of potential war crimes or crimes against humanity. In order for this provisional relief to be granted, the ICJ would have to determine not that a genocide is happening. That's for a later date. Probably will take years to litigate that definitively. They just have to decide that it's plausible. It's plausible that Israel is violating the Genocide Convention. As you mentioned at the outset, I'm a lawyer. I've been studying this conflict and the relevant laws, including the Genocide Convention, for many years. I've looked at the evidence very carefully. My opinion as a lawyer is that it is a slam dunk that this order should be granted. In fact, I think there's already sufficient evidence for a definitive determination that Israel's committing genocide. But There should be no difficulty in this court coming to the conclusion that it's plausible that they're committing genocide. I mean, we look at the statements that have come out of the entirety of the political elite in Israel. They're openly declaring their intention to destroy a substantial part of the Palestinian population, civilian population, and they're actually carrying it out before our very eyes. So if they apply the law, I think that there's no question that they're going to grant the relief. The only issue that we need to be, those of us who care about the Palestinian people, the only issue we have to be concerned about is political pressure being applied behind the scenes on the judges of the ICJ or their own ideological inclinations overcoming their sense of justice. I think that even with all the pressure that my prediction is that they will rule in South Africa's favor, although I am concerned about political pressure. And the main reason why I believe that they will ultimately do that is because they rendered a decision in 2020. It was essentially the same judges, same panel of judges in a case brought by Gambia against Myanmar, which asked for essentially the same relief. And the evidence there was not as compelling as it is in this case, that there's a genocide taking place. I don't know how these judges would maintain a shred of credibility if they, after having rendered that decision, denied to South Africa the provisional relief it's requesting. And so if I were a betting man, I would say, oh yeah, they're going to give to South Africa essentially the relief that it's requested.
Dimitri, what's the significance now? I think I just read today, Indonesia is bringing criminal accusations against the United States and Israel. Am I correct? Have you heard about that?
They didn't just bring it for since October 7, but for the entire 70-something years of occupation, which is significant. Two other countries, which are Mexico and Chile, are jointly also submitting to the ICC proposals again for Israel genocide. So yeah, it's spreading, like rebellion. Yeah. Go ahead, Dimitri.
I think Regis, and I could be mistaken about this, what Indonesia's going to ask the court to address is the settlements, I believe. But in that regard, the ICJ actually has already entered an advisory opinion in 2004. This is another reason, by the way, why I'm quite hopeful about the South Africa's case. In 2004, it rendered a unanimous opinion. Even the American judge agreed that the settlements in the West Bank violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. But it was an advisory opinion, and Israel didn't participate in that proceeding. So as I understand it, what the Indonesian government plans to do is to seek a definitive determination, which will be binding upon Israel, not simply an advisory opinion, that it's violating the Fourth Geneva Convention. That's a slam dunk, absolutely slam dunk. In terms of complicity of the Biden administration, that too is a slam dunk. I mean, they're providing the bunker buster bombs in real time to the Israeli government. They are being used to destroy refugee camps, entire refugee camps, wipe out families. The New York Times the pro-Israel New York Times put out a report in December after they consulted with a number of experts, and they looked at the bombing patterns in Gaza. And they came to the conclusion that the Israeli military, and this word is absolutely critical, routinely fired dumb bunker buster bombs, 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs into parts of Gaza where they had told the civilian population to go on the premise that it was safe.
Yeah.
What more proof do you need that the Israeli military is trying to maximize civilian deaths in Gaza? I mean, there's a mountain of other evidence, but just that alone is compelling evidence that they're trying to wipe out the civilian population, or at least a substantial part of it. So if they were to go, unfortunately, the ICC has a Western puppet and a coward by the name of Karim Khan as its prosecutor.
He was the one who issued the arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, right?
That's right. For removing children from a war zone, Karim Khan rushed to the courthouse and filed an indictment against Vladimir Putin within a matter of months of his coming into the office. But we've had the settlements are a war crime. They're a war crime. We've known for decades that the settlements were a violation of international law and a war crime. And he's not even lifted a finger with respect to that. Okay. And now he has a genocide unfolding before his very eyes, and he won't intervene at all. So that institution has been completely and utterly discredited. The ICC, as far as I'm concerned, it just scrapped the damn thing. It's nothing but a tool of Western imperialism. And the last hope for the legitimacy and credibility of the international legal architecture is the ICJ.
I just wanted to say Serbia agrees with you 100% because it was partially made for them, the ICC.
I'm sure that's true. Certainly, that's the way it was applied in practice.
Yeah, and of course,
I didn't even realize there was a big distinction between the ICC and the ICJ. But I'm a layperson, not a international law expert. What do you think the time frame is for getting a ruling back from the ICJ?
I hope we'll see one this week.
Yeah.
I understand there are 2 or 3 of the judges who are retiring at the end of the month. So
Wow.
I mean, the main reason why they should do it is because people are dying every day. Hundreds of people are dying every day in Gaza. But they, as a practical matter, I think have to get this decision out by the end of January because of the retirement of several judges. Just on the distinction, it's a good question. Just briefly, the ICJ is an instrument of the United Nations Charter. So everybody who's a signatory to the UN Charter is bound by the decisions of the ICJ. The International Criminal Court is a much smaller grouping of nations, which are much more dominated by the West. So there are a number of countries like China, like Russia, that are not. And Israel's not a signatory to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The United States
or the US, yeah,
or the US, yeah.
so the Hague Act,
Yes. And so the ICC is more dependent upon Western patronage for its funding than the ICJ is, and I think that's one reason why it's tended to be significantly more biased than the ICJ.
That's really interesting. I had no idea about that. I kind of lumped the two together, but it's interesting. Yeah, one is way more dominated by the U.S. and used as a tool of imperialism, which explains kind of why we saw such a robust, denunciation of Israel at the ICC. I mean, even though they didn't broadcast it on the mainstream platforms in the West, you could still find it on YouTube, which I did. But it was a pretty compelling case. Guys, what else? We're 57 minutes in. This is a great discussion.
I'm really enjoying it. Depends on how much time you had, but I have a thought that I could maybe phrase as a question somehow quickly. Depending on how this goes, I mean, what I see is, again, part of the grander picture. Either the ICJ brings the sane ruling. Most of the world is up in arms, like really, really upset about Israel's behavior, or its credibility as an institution is gone. Like very soon we can see with the financial institutions in Europe, because as you know, we're trying to steal the 300 billion of Russian sovereign assets. Right. So in that case, and I've already seen on RT, TASS, Russian outlets, and on Global Times, the Chinese outlets, that we might need alternate institutions within the BRICS. We need another world court. We might need another financial center, another grain center. China has been very big about, okay, we have to now become the financial center of the world. I don't see the West winning either way. Either the genocide is naked to everybody, and it is, but then it's legally naked, or they've lost it all. I mean, all of the power that went along with such institutions, I think, evaporates almost instantly. What do you guys think?
I think that's spot on. This is the West is going to lose no matter what the outcome of this is. Yeah, this decision, because you're right. This will put the premature of legal sanction on the arguments, the belief of the vast majority of the human population that a genocide is unfolding in Gaza, which is a disaster for the West, an absolute disaster, or the international, the whole United Nations, post World War II architecture, which has tended to serve American interests over the years. Is going to be totally discredited. And then people are going to start to look to alternative security arrangements. And of course, the most obvious choice at this stage is the BRICS. And that's where we're heading. We're heading to a world in which there's going to be either a complete revamping of the existing international legal architecture so that it begins to function in a more equitable manner that reflects various interests around the world and not simply Western interests. Or that whole system is going to be completely abandoned and a new one is going to spring up in its place that is going to be multipolar in character.
Yeah.
Let's get back to Israel if we can, because Dimitri, on my show, I asked you, I want you to make a point now. Does Israel have as a state, have a future?
No. Israel, as we know it, is finished. It's absolutely finished. It's just a question of what it's going to be replaced by. It's going to lose. It is losing militarily. And by that, I mean not that its army is going to be necessarily destroyed, but its army is going to be, at a bare minimum, stalemated by forces that it should be able to defeat on paper. Economically, Israel is being devastated, and I don't think it's ever going to go back to the level of prosperity that it knew. Not if it continues to function in the way as it has in the past. Politically, it's become a pariah. Legally, it's going to become a pariah. In every single conceivable sense, Israel is going to suffer a strategic defeat. And so what will the new Israel look like? Well, I think what's going to happen, first of all, is that the world will impose upon Israel one way or another, either the two-state solution, which means it's going to have to give up land it's controlled for decades, and it's going to have to dismantle settlements, or a one-state solution in which everybody has at least theoretically equal rights and votes. And then when that happens, I think that, because if you look at the polling, it's very clear that a majority of the Israeli Jewish population supports what the government does to the Palestinian people, and they have frankly a virulent hatred for Palestinians. A lot of people in Israel have been indoctrinated to hate Palestinians, and so if they're forced to either live beside a Palestinian state or in one state where everybody has the right to vote, I believe a lot of sadly, I don't want to see this happen, but I think a lot of those, the Israeli Jewish population will leave. They'll abandon Israel. And already from a demographic perspective, the Palestinians outnumber in historic Palestine by a slight amount the Jewish population. And if they begin to leave in large numbers, and if a lot of, and they've relied historically on, Jews from Western countries coming and emigrating to Israel. And if those people stop coming, then the demographic imbalance is going to grow enormously. And eventually it's going to become demographically and politically a much more a Palestinian state than, as it's called today, a Jewish state. So whatever happens, I think the gig is up for Israel. And it's just a question of whether this is going to happen with massive amounts of death, because this could get far worse, particularly for Israel, or whether it happens in a much less painful and by means of economic and political pressure rather than outright military devastation.
I support Plan B out of those two, but yeah, what's worrying is how Bibi Netanyahu and the political class, Ben Gvir, other Likud members are reacting to this. Is, we're going to go straight up into Lebanon. We're going to take the Philadelphia Gap from Egypt, which is a declaration of war, only because the big American aircraft carriers there. It's like, Mussolini is threatening people with Hitler's army. That's basically what it is. It's really scary. But hopefully, Western opinion is now very strongly against Netanyahu's continued presidency as well. Hopefully, that can come to a more peaceful end. And one other thing I wanted to say, which is striking to me, as you said, the population very much supports this genocide. And what I liked about the evidence, 83 pages of it, that South Africa brought to the ICJ, wasn't just the quotes from the leaders, but from the soldiers on the front and their behavior and their chants and what they do there. And that was very worth bringing to the attention of the world. I think it could be eye-opening if everybody saw that. That's a perfect case.
100%. You may know that some major media organizations in the West live streamed the Israeli submissions, but didn't live stream. And then somebody, I don't know who, put together, assembled actors from the Game of Thrones and other famous actors, including Susan Sarandon, to read in a video the South African submissions. And this video, they're doing it in a series of videos, and the videos went viral. So all the efforts to suppress, including this wonderful evidence, I shouldn't say wonderful, it's actually horrifying in one sense, but wonderful in the sense that it's so effective in conveying the reality of what's happening. These soldiers chanting, as you see devastation behind.
There are no innocent civilians.
Yes, and invoking the name of Amalek, this character from the Bible whose people were to be completely wiped out by the Israelites, including the women and the children, dancing up and down, chanting his name. I mean, again, what more evidence do you need that the project here is one of genocide? It's astonishing that we're even having to debate this.
Couldn't agree with you more.
How can we understand, how can we come to terms with this psychology that has been inculcated within Zionism and within the Zionist state? Like, I mean, this psychology it's psychopathic in a sense, but you know, it's a psychopathy that we have to deal with, because this is really, you know, a lot of Zionists in Israel see themselves as under attack, and everything that's going on is proof that humanity is anti-Semitic. You know what I'm saying? So they have this understanding, and it's real to them, but it's psychopathic. But how do you deal with that? I mean,
look, I just did. I was just invited. This is a rare event nowadays, but I was invited onto a mainstream media network to debate somebody about Israel. And the character I debated, his name is Howard Levitt. He has a column in the National Post, one of the most widely read newspapers in Canada, where he has been vilifying people who support Israel. So we had this half-an-hour debate on a major radio station in Toronto, and the stuff that came out of that man's mouth was delusional. He actually said, I couldn't believe it when I was listening to the audio of it again, that this was the most moral war waged in history. Okay.
He's the Michael Rappaport of Canada.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, you know, that guy. If anybody wants to see the truly ugly face of Zionism, watch Michael Rappaport's deranged, lunatic, unhinged videos. You can't reason with these people. Nope. I mean, it's impossible, unfortunately. And so the world is going to end up imposing a solution on Israel that a lot of its citizens ain't going to like. And that's just the bottom line. You cannot reason with these people. They are completely detached from reality.
Yeah, it's sad, but I think Sergei Lavrov said it best, that you weren't the only ones to suffer in the Nazi Holocaust. The 27 million Russians, Soviet people, also died, and that doesn't give you carte blanche to do anything in the internet, anything you want in the international arena, and that has to become real, I think.
Somebody else was arguing that Israel is not beholden to any kind of rule of law because, you know, they were a victim of genocide themselves. Like, I mean, somebody literally just argued that.
It was a French
probably the ICJ defense.
Yeah, the French foreign minister just came out with a statement that said because of the Holocaust, which was a European atrocity, it wasn't committed by Palestinians or any other members of the Arab world or the Muslims. It was committed by Europeans who claimed to be Christians. He was saying, this French foreign minister, after Macron said that his government was going to respect the ICJ's decision. I mean, this is just classic Macron. The man is such a snake. He says one thing one day and another thing the other day. No wonder the Russian government has just completely stopped talking to that man. He's a complete snake. And he's done it again. And now he has somebody telling, or senior member of his government, telling people that you can't possibly hold the Jewish state accountable for genocide because of a Holocaust perpetrated upon the Jewish people by Europeans decades ago. It's insanity.
What I can say to France is, please send your mercenaries to Kharkov, and Russia will take care of you.
Yeah, if they have any sense about them, they'll refuse to go. But we live in the West. It's just the whole public discourse just boggles the mind. Frankly, there are days I'm speechless listening to the nonsense that comes out of people's mouths.
Tell me a little.
You're gonna send us off with some optimism.
Yeah, Reverend Regis does the best sermons at the end. I just wanted to ask, because in Hungary, I've lost a lot of conversation friends and people, first to the Ukraine war, now to Gaza. What about, I mean, I've seen everything from Canadian politicians, including Juncker and all that shit. What about the people on the streets? How do they think about these things? I just wanted to get a reading on the public. What do they think? About
when it comes, the views about the Ukraine war and what's happening in historic Palestine and Canada and the West generally, I think, are two different subjects. So I've been to probably on average 2 protests a week for the last 3 months.
Good.
I've been asked to speak at a number of them. And what I see is a lot of anger in the streets, a lot of anger. And to be honest with you, I'm surprised that there hasn't been any serious violence. Of course, the Israel lobby is claiming that there are rampaging mobs all over the place looking to commit mass murder of Jews. This is, of course, a flagrant lie, but there's a lot of anger, and it isn't dying down. In fact, I think that in a significant proportion of the population, it's escalating because nothing is being done to stop this atrocity. When it comes to the Ukraine war, we still have a lot of work to do in the West to wake people up to the reality. We're in the early stages of that process. You know, and in terms of the future, despite everything I've said, I actually am very optimistic. Well, I would say I'm much more optimistic now than I was 2 years ago, because I see an end of the era of U.S. hegemony. It's coming. And I believe that likely what will replace it is it's going to be imperfect. There's still going to be lots of problems we're going to have to solve, but it's going to be a very significant improvement on what we've had for the last several decades.
I completely agree, and I share your optimism. But it turns out you're the young Regis. That was the perfect sermon, unless Elder Regis wants to add something. I think that was
No,
great.
I'm not going to add to that.
Thank
In
you
that
guys
case-
very much. It was really great to meet you, Dimitri. Thanks for coming on. I hope I can have you back on
Sure.
at some point.
Sure. It was a pleasure talking to you guys. Really
Great
was.
to meet you.
Great to
And
meet
nice
you.
to see you again, Regis.
Stay after the show. We'll discuss more. We will see you guys next week. Thank you for